everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Bet Avichai. As usual, as you see me, I just want to remind you before we begin, please silence your cell phone. Thank you very much. And now for the more interesting part of the evening.
I hope so. Good evening. I'd like to dedicate this shir to a young woman who was killed this week, Daphna Meir. I didn't know her personally. All I had to know really was her photograph as it was shown on television. And then I found out some details, mostly from television, details you probably know, about what a strong-spirited, strong-minded, free, independent, humorous, high-minded person she was. Very unusual person. So someone suggested to me that I dedicate the shir to her memory, and I felt quite right about doing it because I have been thinking about her quite a lot this week. Yehi zichra baruch. And so we go back to Yetziat Mitzrayim. We've already had Geula, in a sense, right? It all happened last week. Right? That's a strange perspective on Geula. Redemption happened last week. That is, in the technical aspect, that is, we actually left Egypt. Yetziat Mitzrayim, Yatsu me'eretz Mitzrayim, last week, very definitely. And what do we have in this week's Parsha? So I'd like to say that what we have here is Redemption Act 2. It turns out that it's not a one-act play. It's at least a two-act play. And in fact, there are probably a good deal more acts. The second act of the process of Geula Shenit, as the Sfat Emet calls it. Second version, second edition now of redemption. And that is the crossing of the Red Sea, Kriyat Yam Suf. And everything that's involved in that act, by way of the people, in this case, really having in some way to take risks themselves and to somewhere stand behind their own redemption, to actually be there, to be walking through on dry land in the midst of the sea. B'toch hayam b'yabasha. That's what they have to do. And that, of course, is a terrible paradox. We're used to thinking of it as, well, it's very simple. There was a corridor there in the middle of God massed up the waters. He piled up the waters on either side so that there was a passage left clear. And they walked through on dry land. But twice the expression is used, vayavo b'toch hayam b'yabasha, and then again at the end of the song, it's b'yabasha b'toch hayam. And I suggest that there is an irreducible paradox. That is, forget about corridors and paths through the sea. They were both on dry land and in the midst of the sea. B'toch hayam. That was their position. They were very safe and dry, on the one hand, and on the other hand, they were lost in seaness. They were lost in the place, one of those zones where the human being doesn't like to be lost. According to a very famous midrash, God created the world originally in 3 zones. One is Yeshuv, the part that was meant to be settled by human beings and made civilized and livable. Another was Yam, the area of the sea, and the third is the area of the Midbar, of the wilderness. So it seems that now, having left Mitzrayim, they are now awash at sea. They're all at sea. And they are going to spend 40 years tracking the trackless desert, simply wandering around in the desert. The 2/3 of the world that really are not made for human habitation. The only place that's made for human habitation is what we call Yeshuv. That is, settled cities, towns, villages, agriculture, schools, post offices. Have we talked about this already? I don't think I've mentioned this. I did. At any rate, so yes, I did. I remember. I said Beis Avichai. Yes, places, nice places where you know exactly what you're going there for. You know what you're going to get. Where you feed your soul and your spirit, and you come out with a certain evaluation of what you've had. You are somewhere in control. And then there is the Yam, and then there is the Midbar. And the people are now having to go through the Yam. But before they ever get to the Yam read retroactively, after you've read the whole Parsha, we realize that the drama of Yetziat Mitzrayim, take 2, begins the minute they've crossed the border. They are no sooner out of Eretz Mitzrayim than complaints begin. Now, I say there's no sooner out, it actually takes about a week. That's the understanding. It takes about a week, and it's under the dire circumstance, really the horrifying circumstance, of looking around and seeing that Paro is pursuing them. And at that point, they really let Moshe have it, and they say, Ma zot asita lanu? What on earth did you do to us in taking us out of Egypt? What a catastrophic, crazy thing you did to us, taking us away from serving Egypt. Chadal mimenu, just leave us alone. Were there not enough graves in Egypt that you had to bring us out to die here? In other words, really quite ugly sarcasms and complaints and bitterness. And so on. Justified or not justified, we'll be looking at that. Now, this story of, in a way, undoing Yetziat Mitzrayim. As soon as they're out of Egypt, by complaints we mean that they actually are talking about going back. Right away, as soon as they've left, they talk about the desire to return. It doesn't take 2 minutes, if I can excuse the exaggeration. In fact, it literally doesn't take, almost literally, doesn't take 2 minutes, because what do we find at the very beginning of the Parsha? Before the people have done anything, we find complaint and the desire to return to Egypt in no lesser place, no less prestigious place than the mind of God. What do I mean by that? Have a look at the beginning of the Parsha. I'm always hoping that some people will bring a chumash. I think if I drop hints often enough, it might happen. It was when Pharaoh let the people go. God didn't lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though it was the closer route. Ki karofu. And that's the way it's normally read, even though, nevertheless, he took them around by a more complicated route. Another way of reading that ki, since ki has many meanings, is because it was close. And here is the paradox right away. Already we are being signaled that we are not on a straight road now. That we are, intellectually speaking, in terms of understanding, that what we're being told here is that God didn't take them the obvious route just because it was obvious. He avoided it because it was too obvious. So right away, in a way, we have the ground cut from under our feet, if I can put it like that. Excuse me? What are you saying? And then you have to start thinking and trying to make that make some sense in your mind. So it's no longer so pshat. We're not so clear that they're out of Egypt. Now begins celebration. We go straight for the song of the sea. Turns out that God immediately is having thoughts. Ki amar Elokim, because God said, and here you have the explanation of why he took them the unobvious way, not the direct route, but the indirect route. So we have this rare access to the mind of God, actually to listening to what God is saying or what God is thinking. Ki amar. He doesn't say it to anybody at this point. It's not a communication. So it's an unusually intimate insight into God's thinking, as it were, in human terms. What is God's thinking at this point? It's an unusual move, I repeat. Pen yinachem ha'am berotam milchama v'shavu mitzrayma. Lest the people change their minds when they experience war, when they have to confront their first war, and they will return to Egypt. That is, God is already expecting. Right? The pen isn't really, it's not a low-order expectation. It's a high-order expectation. That is, God knows that this is very likely to happen. This is what's going to happen. He knows the human heart, and he says the first thing that's going to happen as soon as they encounter any kind of conflict, and we know by hindsight that it's going to happen not long after this, they're going to be facing Amalek, the war against Amalek. And so immediately at the first obstacle, they are going to be turning around. They'll change their minds. Yinachem. Interesting word, Yinachem. Usually we translate nechama as to be comforted. Here it can't mean they will be comforted. It means in a way almost the opposite. It means they will change their minds not for the good, but for the bad. Comfort is when you change your mind from a sad prospect and you think about it in a more positive way. That's comfort. To change your mind in this sense is to regret. They will regret that they have left Egypt, and they will turn around to go back to Egypt. And here, of course, so Rashi translates Nechama. Have a look at your source page now. Rashi is now going to elaborate the drama that's implicit within this pasuk. And he's going to make it very clear. What is the paradoxical tension in this pasuk? Ki karofu, just because it was close. Number one, right, the second quote. And since it's close, it's easy to go back by the same way as they leave. If God had brought them out by a straight, direct road, then it would have been very easy for them to turn, when they want to turn around and go back, simply to slide right back into Egypt. So what is God doing then? He's not actually interfering with their minds. His expectations are that they're not good. That no sooner have they left, they'll want to go back. All he's doing is making it a little harder for them to act on their minds. That their mind shouldn't be able to lead them in action straight back to Egypt. Let's have a little delaying on the way. Let's have a little circumnavigation. You know, they're going to have to get lost a bit before they find their way back. And then let's look further in Rashi. Look how he's quoting the Mechilta. And here is the logic. Im halchu derech yashar hayu chozrim. Even if they had gone the straight way, they would have returned very easily. Look, even when God took them hakafa, a derech me'ukam, hakafa, right, a circle. He took them around in circles. He led them a fine chase, you know, so that it would be hard for them to find their way back. And derech me'ukam. Me'ukam is an ugly word. I want to point out, it's got an unpleasant smell about it. Me'ukam is crooked. You know, that's not the way to go. You know, derech me'ukam is not in general what we recommend, you know, metaphorically speaking, to people. And here the word is, he uses the word deliberately and says that God took them the zigzag, crooked route, and even so, it didn't take long till they wanted to go back to Egypt. And Rashi, interestingly, doesn't pay attention to all the complaints and all the many times they say, we want to go back. But he goes straight to the point in Sefer Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers, with the story of the spies, where they actually decide, it's a policy decision, Nitna Rosh v'nashuva Mitzrayim. Let's appoint another leader, and let's return to Egypt. Now, so he's saying, look how long did it take till they got to that very serious point of deciding to return? About a year. Approximately a year, I think. So how much more so if it had been a straight route? They would have lost courage much earlier, or they would have changed their mind much earlier. So that's why he took them the crooked route. How much more so im holicham b'pshuta, in the derech yashar, in the straight route, on the simple route. Now these are obviously good words. In general, derech yashar is certainly a recommended way to go. You go by derech yashar, go by the straight route, meaning metaphorically. And here he's deliberately playing with these associations, and he's saying God took them by the way that you normally wouldn't advise people to guide other people. The crooked route, the complicated route, round and around instead of straight, ethically, cognitively, in every way, it's not the way to go. But this is the way he led them, because of what? Pen Yenachem. Lest they, and here Rashi gives us a kind of basic key to the word nachama. Just because it can mean both regret and comfort, he wants to single out, he wants to isolate the core meaning of the word nachama. And he says what it is machshava acheret, another way of thinking. And he will do this rather often. Whenever the word nachama comes up in a context where it's a little, we're not quite sure why it means what it seems to mean, he'll say, well, forget about the specifics of comfort and regret. The idea of nechama is thinking differently, changing your mind, right? Isn't that a strange English expression, to change your mind? You know, how many minds do you have to change from one to the other? Well, it turns out, maybe one could say that, in fact, we have quite a lot of minds. A whole wardrobe of minds. You know, we change 3 times a day if we are that way inclined. So to change the mind, Yachshavu machshava al sheyatzu. God says it's all on the books. It's absolutely probable that they'll start thinking thoughts. I love this expression. Yachshavu machshava al sheyatzu. They will start thinking thoughts about the fact that they have left Egypt. In other words, Yetziat Mitzrayim, which is like it's a code term. You say it without thinking too much. Yetziat Mitzrayim, Exodus, liberty, salvation, suddenly becomes something the people are going to think about. They did it partly under their own steam, but very largely under the steam of what we called last week, chipazon. That in some way they were rushed off their feet by internal pressures and external pressures and the pressures of God himself. Chipazon shchina, that God himself was in chipazon. They're not really acting on their own, they're not acting within their own means. They're not keeping, they're acting beyond their means. And the time is going to come very quickly in which they start thinking. And to start thinking thoughts means you open yourself up to another mind. You say, well, I am not at all as sure as I was. And then you will begin to say, as the people say to Moshe, Ma zot asita lanu. What on earth did you do to us? Which is exactly what we say when we have changed our minds. When we begin to think that we must have been crazy to think that way, because now I see it quite differently. So Pharaoh, when he changes his mind, which happens immediately after this, it's called lahafoch levav. It's a slightly different but similar expression. He turned his heart over. Meaning, and he also says, ma zot asinu. It's actually the same expression. What on earth did we do in letting them go? What seemed like a sane decision yesterday, suddenly I look at and I just can't believe myself. What did I do? Does it sound familiar? I'm sure there are very, very clear-minded people here to whom it never happens. But, us, we fuzzier people, experience this quite a lot. Suddenly you see things in a different light. Yakshavu machshava. They will think a thought. Now, on the face of it, to think a thought doesn't sound like a bad thing. Thinking thoughts, it's rather almost to be recommended, I would say, right? It's a really good thing to do with one's brain, to think thoughts. And God doesn't seem to be particularly disapproving of it as such. All he's saying is, I'm going to make sure that they have, it's a kind of liberal approach to thinking. They can think the thoughts, but I'm going to make it harder for them to act on their thoughts immediately, to panic and act on their thoughts. So there's going to be a kind of space, a safe space, for them to think all the thoughts they want. And that's called the midbar. Nefuchim hem bamidbar. That's what Paro thinks about them. They are confused in the desert. They are lost in the desert, and maybe there's some truth to it. A desert is a place to get lost in. That used to be the idea of a liberal education. Yes, I seem to remember that you would go to a university for 3-4 years and you would get lost in thought, without having to pay any social prices for your thoughts. You weren't expected to get married, you weren't expected to make a living. Politics was supposed to be beyond the bounds, right? So things have changed a little bit since then. It's no longer such a safe space. But that was the idea. So this is going to be the university, the liberal university, the midbar experience, in which they will think their thoughts. What kind of thoughts will they be, clearly? Thoughts of returning to Egypt. That is, regressive thoughts. Thoughts that mean that they will undo Exodus. That whatever was achieved in the Exodus, they will undo. And if they can't do that in action, they will do it in their minds. That is, they will begin to think through what the implications of leaving Egypt, and they will very quickly, calling on fantasy, calling sometimes on quite rational, pragmatic thought, they will very quickly begin to have skeptical thoughts. Skeptical means not really knowing what is going on behind you. This is Stanley Cavell's very interesting. That is, you don't know what's going on behind. What did I leave behind there? And so I begin to reimagine what I've left behind. And then you glorify it in your mind. There's a fantasy, perhaps, about it. Why on earth did I leave home? And I'll call it a kind of nostalgia. Right? This has been their home for 210 years, 400 years, depending how you count, a long time. And there's a desire to return, even before it becomes a practical plan. It lives in the realm of fantasy at first, very bitter fantasy, as we'll see. Now, that movement of wanting to turn around and go back, I want to suggest, it reminds me of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, yes? The fatal moment at which Orpheus, who is the musician who can charm tigers and make stones speak, yes? He has this enormous musical power, and music is going to be important for us in this Parsha. Right? This is Parshat Shirah. It's about singing. He has this great power of music. The first opera that was ever written was by Monteverdi in the very early 17th century, in the 16 noughts. Does anyone know for sure? It was called Orfeo, and in that opera, he enacts the power of music. The power of music, which is particularly in opera, in the arias that are sung. And I'll quote Stanley Cavell on this. He says, "After moving hell to release his wife, despite charming tigers and stones, at the last moment he cannot redeem Eurydice for their everyday life together again. He can't actually get her out of there because he turns around." And he turns around, and that's the movement, says Stanley Cavell, and I want to try to open that up. It's the movement of doubt, uncertainty about what is happening behind us, which is, of course, something we recognize. If you're walking ahead and you don't have any communication with what's going on behind you. And so he has to turn around, and in turning around, right, effectively, the real power of his music comes to a limit. He can do wonders with stones and tigers, but yeah, he can't actually get his wife out of there to come and live a kind of normal life. The power of music won't do that. I wanted to try to pick that up again a bit later. So what do we have? The danger is they'll go back. The reality is they're going to think about going back. And this is in God's mind, so we privilege that. We understand that God understands. And we know something now about the human mind, about, I would say, the human heart. Yitnu lev. They will set their hearts on returning, says Rashi. It's the heart-mind. It's the feeling-thinking part of a person that I'm interested in and will keep coming up today. God seems to understand how that works. In view of all this, it's rather surprising, isn't it, that if you look at chapter 14, after the journey has been, how they travel has been described, you have God giving Moshe the first commandment to Bnei Israel in their freedom, in their free state. What's the first thing you should say to them? It's really quite striking. Perek Yud Dalet Pasuk Bet, Daber el Bnei Israel, v'yashuvu. Speak to the children of Israel, and they should go back. Excuse me? I thought the idea is to get away from Egypt. No, they should turn around, but then you read, of course, that's not the end of the verse. It's Perek Yud Dalet Pasuk Bet. Oh, it's not in the sources, it's in the Chumash. I don't put the Chumash sources on the page. V'yashuvu v'yachanu lifnei piachirot. They should turn around, go back, and encamp beside a place called Piachirot, which is imagined to be two cliffs facing one another. In other words, again, a kind of doubleness, sense of ambivalence, of ambiguity. And they should encamp there by the sea, and that's where they will be caught when Pharaoh changes his mind back in Egypt. God goes on to say, I'm going to again strengthen his mind. You thought we had drawn a line under the whole drama. We'd come to the end of the drama. No, I am again going to interfere with his mind to give him the strength of his convictions. And he will come riding after you, take the whole of Egypt with him. And that's in fact what happens. And he will find you right here. Yashuvu. Isn't that really counterindicated? If if what you're afraid of is that the people are going to return to Egypt, you would think the good thing to do would be perhaps to put as much distance as possible between them and Egypt. Let them cover ground. And instead, God is saying, let them turn around and go back. It's counterintuitive. It's counter-indicated. What could this possibly mean? And moreover, we read that when God has said this to Moshe, and Moshe has conveyed it to the people, at the end of Pasuk Daled, we read the words, Vaya'asu chen. And they did exactly that. That the people did what God had said, and they turned around and went back. And that is understood, we'll have a look now at Rashi, that Rashi suggests, quoting from the Mechilta, which is the source midrash that's constantly under his hand here, he suggests that this was a very difficult thing for this slave people, this escaped people, to do. To turn around and go back towards the place where they have been a slave, go back in that direction, in fact, back on their tracks. Right? It's in every way a counterintuitive thing to do. Have a look at 3a. Sorry, number two. V'yashuvu, let them go back. Le'achorehem letzad Mitzrayim. In case you didn't understand what the word lashuv means, you're kind of goggling at it, what? Then it says, yes, back on their tracks, go back to their rear towards Egypt. That is, in some way, instead of standing their backs to Egypt, they are to set their faces towards Egypt. And what happens is, this is one possibility of what the Torah means by saying, and they did so. Lahagid, number 3a, Vaya'asu chen, and they did so. Lahagid shivchan, this tells you their praise. In other words, this is really to the credit of the people, that they listened to Moshe, and they didn't say the obvious thing, that there was a kind of unconscious choice they made here. They didn't say what you would expect them to say. How can we go close to those who are pursuing us? What we need to do is flee from them. Why do you tell us to go back towards Egypt at the moment when we are most afraid that they are going to want to, they're coming after us, according to what Moshe is telling them. We need to flee from them. They didn't say that, but instead they said, we have only the words of Ben Amram. In other words, they expressed a kind of faith. And they said, well, whatever Moshe says, whatever God says, we'll do it regardless of the logic of it. Now, this is to their credit. So you get a little note to their credit. They really were in a state of faith, in a state of belief, in a positive state where they wanted somewhere to meet their destiny, their historical destiny, so they do exactly what they're told. But the understanding is that it is a counterintuitive thing to do. First of all, the terror of Pharaoh will be upon them, and we're going to read that in just a moment. All right, maybe I'll read it right now. That when Pharaoh catches up with them in the place where they have camped, Pasuk Yud, Pharaoh approached, Vayis'u b'nei Yisrael et einehem, and the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, Vehinei Mitzrayim noseh achareihem. There was Egypt traveling after them, Vayir'u mo'od, and they were very afraid, Vayitzaku el Hashem, and they cried out to God. And that cry is what I want to stay with now. That cry envelops me. Turns out that it's a cry. Cries have many, many possible tones. What kind of cry was this? Well, clearly, we're told in the text that there's one main emotion behind the cry. What's the main emotion? We just read it, yes? Fear. Right. Even those who didn't have a chumash seem to know that. Good. So it's fear. They're motivated by fear. So they cry out in fear. Is it a good cry or is it a bad cry? How do we evaluate this cry? That seems to be the concern of the rabbis in the Mechilta, for instance. And there are those rabbis who read it l'shevach, and they say l'shevach means for credit. In other words, gives them credit, and evaluates them favorably, and says, oh, they really are a high-minded people. They are a people who are capable of tefillah. That when they're in trouble, they turn to God and they pray to God, and there's a kind of spiritual note that they find right away in this tzaka. A tzaka can mean tefillah. It's one of the classic ways in which in the Tanakh prayer is encapsulated in the word tzaka. So that's what it is. So you should know that it is that. On the other hand, there are other rabbis who think the opposite, that they're really crying in scornful, sarcastic, rebellious outrage, anger and outrage against God. Not at all a spiritual, religious state of mind. One interesting fact to notice before we develop this is that in the Mechilta, it's always two particular chachamim who are on either side of this conflict. Rabbi Yoshua is always arguing, interpreting the same text as Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Yoshua says it's l'shevach, and he always spreads his net, he throws his net very wide in order to be able to prove that really it's a creditable act that they did here. And Rabbi Elazar will take exactly the same text, like this one, Vayitzaku el Hashem, they cried out to God, but this is only one example of many. And he will interpret in the opposite direction. And he will say this was a really discreditable move on their part, expression on their part. For instance, we just saw that, on the one hand, they're given credit for going back in this way, counterintuitively in face of the terror of Egypt. We might also say it's also counterintuitive, in view of what we just said, if they have a secret desire to return to Egypt, which they haven't got around to expressing yet, right? This is not the moment for it. If they have that desire to return, then why do they actually return part way in this way? Right? That's not really going to help them in fulfilling their fantasy. This is a different kind of thing altogether. So what is this movement of return? I'll add one commentary that I rather like, and that is the Orach Chaim on this. And what he suggests is that this movement backwards is God's way of making them active in facing Pharaoh. Instead of just sitting there like sitting ducks and shaking in fear when they see Pharaoh approach, they are to do this counterintuitive thing of moving towards Pharaoh. Now that's a kind of act of bravado, you might say. It's an act, it's a counterintuitive act, in which in a way they are doing something absurd, and in that way asserting a certain kind of freedom. And why God, the reason that God wants them to do this, it's a very interesting, he has a Kabbalistic way of thinking of this, which I think we can translate. He says it's because cosmically, metaphysically, the attitude of God towards them was not really one of great compassion at this moment. They weren't in a state that really deserved it. They were actually very far from the ideal condition for a redeemed people who are just coming into their freedom. They're very far from being really there. They're really quite a long way behind. So really, there isn't much midat harachamim around. It's going to be very difficult to get God really to come in and compassionately. So what you have instead is midat hadin. And midat hadin is what human beings in general don't want to invite. We don't want to invite God's attribute of strict justice. Strict justice means just looking at things and evaluating them exactly as they are. Without favoritizing, without being too generous. It's a kind of stark viewpoint on things. I discovered the word stark, so I'm for midat hadin. That midat hadin is stark. What do I mean by stark? Everyone here speaks English, right? Yeah, in a previous class, I had a couple of people who had difficulty with the word stark. So we were all trying to find other ways of saying stark, and then someone brilliantly said, it's like stark in Yiddish. It's not exactly, but there is a connection, clearly. I mean, it's an Anglo-Saxon Germanic root. So it means somewhere the bare thing itself. You're looking through midat hadin, you're looking without rose-colored spectacles, and somewhere, who should escape whipping? Treat every man after his deserts, Hamlet says, and who should escape whipping? Who would come out well from that? And God is in that kind of state. And what the balance of things needs now, almost the spiritual ecology of the world needs, is an act on the part of Bnei Yisrael that will swing things around a little. In other words, an act of freedom, it's not just the obedience, it's the freedom of doing something absurd that takes you to face your terror instead of fleeing from it. And by that act alone, perhaps the balance between midat hadin and midat harachamim will be corrected. Now, among other things, what he means to say is that internally, in the hearts and minds of the Israelites, something will shift. That instead of being terrified slaves, they will begin to discover their own backbone in a way. They'll turn around and they'll do this unwarranted thing of turning around and going back towards Egypt under God's command. And then the Or HaChaim says something that I can only admire. After he's described this state of things and what God wanted to happen, and that's why he told them to go back, this whole elaborate interpretation, he then says, but it didn't work. It didn't work because that's not the way Bnei Yisrael reacted. Right? They don't work by the book. They don't discover freedom in themselves on cue. Right? That's the nature of human freedom. That you can only discover the freedom on your own lights, not because someone manipulates you into an act of freedom. So something here does not work. And so the result is they're extremely afraid. They're really shivering in their shoes, and they cry out. What is crying out then? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? If you look at what they actually say when they're crying out, they say, not enough graves in Egypt that you took us out here to die in the desert. You couldn't find enough places to bury us there. This kind of heavy sarcasm, kind of nihilistic sarcasm, doesn't sound much like prayer. It doesn't. So then what possesses Rabbi Yeshua to insist that this is l'shevach, and in fact they were praying? Or Rashi to say, quoting from the Mechilta, tafsu umnot avotehem biyadehem, that they held on to the specialization of their forefathers. What were their forefathers good at? Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were good at prayer. That was their tool. That was their weapon, as it were. They knew how to pray, and they held on tight to that. In other words, good. This is good news about Bnei Yisrael. How can Rabbi Yeshua say that in the face of what they actually say? Listen to the tone of what they actually say. But Rabbi Yeshua holds on to his view, and Rabbi Elazar holds on to his view. I'll just mention a discussion of this that I found very interesting by Daniel Boyarin in his book, Intertextuality and Midrash, something like that. If the word intertextuality doesn't scare you, then you might be a good candidate for reading this book. It's not an easy book, I will say. It's not bedtime reading, but extremely, extremely acute. Very interesting book, in which he says basically this about what we're talking about here. He says each of the rabbis tries to diminish the ambiguity of Vayitzaku. Vayitzaku could be this, and it could be that. So each one of the rabbis diminishes the ambiguity by espousing one or the other view, and then goes to town, really tries in every possible way to prove, usually by quoting other texts much later on, bringing them all into play and saying all this intertextuality, to prove their point. So what you have is two non-ambiguous views, two unambiguous views, both there in the text, facing off against each other. And each one in some way then is affected by being in the presence of the opposite one. Right. What this suggests, Daniel Boyarin says, there's a kind of double voicing here, a sense that there's a kind of, how does he put it, heterogeneity. Right? These are words that are kind of scary, but heterogeneity in the midrashic evaluations here. We can't help being aware now of ambiguity. Now this one says this, and this one says that, and then we look back at the original text. And this is his main point. He says, and this leads us to understand that the text of the Torah itself is heterogeneous, that it can give birth to opposite points of view, and that people can and will and should back up their own point of view, their own sense of truth, which will exactly contradict what someone else has to say. And that is the midrashic process. That's the midrashic mind, the rabbinic mind, if you will. And this is not in matters of law. This is in matters of how you understand a narrative, how you understand what happened, as it were. Choshvim machshavot. And the machshavot are there in all their difference, right in front of us on the page, in the midrash. What does this mean practically? That you can be tzoek in many different tones. That, for instance, Ramban wants to say, certainly if you look at what they say, it doesn't sound good. It sounds very unpleasant, what they say. And so he wants to deal with the fact that tza'aka can also mean tefillah. So he wants to somehow harmonize the two voices now. So it's tefillah and it's, both are tza'aka. So one suggestion he makes, it's a very interesting attempt here to harmonize things. And to say, well, one view is that one idea might be, I think it's his idea, is that first they started off by praying. They started off in a pious mood. And then when time passed and there was no salvation, they see that the horses are thundering towards them. At that point, their voices sharpen. The voice gets more panicked. And then they turn against God and against Moshe, and they say, so it's a matter of time. Time makes a difference. You can move from one tone of tza'aka to another, to its opposite, because of the passage of time. Right? That is something within how we live. We understand that very well. You can have patience, and then you don't have any patience anymore, and your tone changes from one extreme to another. This is without doing anything. This is just thinking and expressing one's thoughts really in a tza'aka, which is the tone. It's just the tone. It doesn't really matter what you say. It's the tone. Or, another suggestion he makes to harmonize is that there were kitot, that there were different groups among the people. It's a sociological interpretation. Don't think that the people were so homogeneous, that they all thought and said the same thing. Some of them were tzoek, were crying out in prayer, and some of them were crying out in rebellion. That's a nice, it's a very large, here let's say in terms of sociological space. You're making room for two opposite reactions. The other suggestion was in terms of time. That you move from one thought to another thought in the course of time. All that gives you the sense that tza'aka can have many, many possible tones to it. So we have here a word that can be interpreted to mean two opposite things, and it's possible they're both are true. And that somewhere in the end, and here is an overwhelming consensus, I think, particularly among Hasidic writers, but based on earlier interpretations, and that is that in some way God values their tza'aka. That God wants that tza'aka. In some way God absorbs the insult of what they actually say, and he hears something else that he wants in this. Even if it's not necessarily a pure wall-to-wall cry of piety and prayer towards God. What does God value about a tza'aka, a human tza'aka? Perhaps you remember that the first sound we ever heard out of Bnei Israel, right? They start off at the beginning of Sefer Shemot in absolute silence. The first 2 chapters, they haven't opened their mouths. Paro does all the talking and all the edicts and the decreeing, and his voice fills the air. And there is no response from the slave people. The first time we hear a sound out of their mouth, it's pure sound. It's pure voice. Vaye'anchu b'nei Yisrael, right at the end of Perek Bet, what we call the murmuring deep, a couple of 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. 4 different words for groaning, crying, screaming, shrieking, wailing. We have a lot of words in English. And it seems that Hebrew is fairly rich also. It's something we know about. We know about that expression, which could actually have many different tones. If there are 4 different words used there, it means that there's a whole repertoire of cries. When it comes to crying, we have a lot of tones that can be used. So that is the first thing we hear from them. It's only later they actually begin to use words. They actually begin to channel themselves into dibur. Here, what we hear is this tza'aka, and what I'd like to do now is to take you through a very strange and rather disturbing midrash about which I'm sure you will have complicated reactions. And I do as well. But I think just because of that, it's valuable. When Israel left Egypt, number 4, what were they like? They were like a dove who was fleeing from an eagle. And the dove entered a crevice in the rock, and she found there a snake nesting in there. And she goes inside the crevice slightly, but she can't really go in because there is the snake, and she can't go backwards because there is the eagle. So what did she do? She began to cry out, tzavachat. She began to cry out, umitapachat be'agafeha. It's such a poignant detail. And she flaps her wings desperately. She's just, it's like, that is the shriek also, the fluttering of her wings. She doesn't know where to go. She's stuck in place, as it were. She doesn't know where to go. To the dovecote owner. She's crying out to the dovecote owner, come and save me. Why are we suddenly into doves and serpents and so on? Hashmi'ini et kolech, yonati b'chagvei hasela. We're spreading our net wide now. We're going to Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, which is the inner story of the Exodus in some interpretations. It's the heart story, the inside story. And there you read, Yonati b'chagvei hasela, my dove in the crevice in the rock. Hashmi'ini et kolech, let me hear your voice. V'har'eni et mar'ayich, and let me see your face, how you look. Ki kolech arev, because your voice is sweet. That is, what is this like? It's like a dove who knows on some level that if she cries out, then the dovecote owner will come and save her. We still haven't got to the end of this. We need to go further now. So what do we have here? This was like the Israelites by the sea. There they were stuck there by the sea. They couldn't go forwards, they couldn't go backwards. They couldn't go into the sea and they couldn't go back toward there were the Egyptians blocking their way. So what do they do in this situation? They're very afraid, so they cry out. And immediately God saves them. Okay, I get that. That somewhere, so far so good. I don't think there's too much uneasiness at this point. That when in trouble, what do? You cry out to God. And then God comes and saves. So leave reality questions out of it. We're not supposed to think at this point of people who didn't cry out and were not saved. In this particular paradigm case, which stands as the great myth of salvation, they cried out, and because of the cry, God saved them. And then the Midrash goes just that bit further, quite a bit further, and gives another mashal, another parable. This is like a king who had an only daughter, and he was desirous of hearing her sicha. Now, I'm not sure how to translate sicha. It's a very interesting word. Translate it, her conversation, discourse. I think discourse is probably the best we can do at this point. Yes, I won't say anything more about it at the moment. He liked, I should say something like, he liked to hear her, he was desirous, mitaveh, it's quite a strong word. He delighted in hearing her speaking. That is something about the way she speaks that he loved to hear. So what did he do? He issued a proclamation and said all his people should come to this open area, this arena, and he then hinted to his servants that they should pretend to be bandits and fall on his daughter suddenly. And then she cried out, she began to cry out, Abba, Abba, Hatzileni, Father, Father, save me. And then he said to her afterwards, justifying himself, presumably, he said, if I had not done that to you, you would not have cried out. Lo hayita tzovachat. Yes? You wouldn't have cried out and said, Father, save me. What's this like? This is like the Israelites in Egypt. When they were enslaved, they began to cry out from the work. And that's the 4 expressions that we talked about before. that they begin to howl and cry and wail, and 4 different ways, tones for crying out. And when God heard that cry, that's what made him save them. Vayishma Elokim et nakatem. God heard their cry, and that's when, as it were, God is aroused. Something dormant is aroused, some force of redemption is aroused, and it's aroused by a cry, by a human cry. God heard their prayers, and he took them out with a strong hand and outstretched arm, and so on. So what then happened? Immediately, God, after that, wanted to hear desired to hear their voice. Right? This time it just says kolan, to hear their voice. That is, not to hear anything particularly intelligent that they have to say. It's not the content. It's just, I love to hear your voice. I want to hear your true voice. So what did he do? Oh, velo hayu rotzin. Very interesting and very difficult. And they didn't want. In other words, they didn't want to use their voice. They didn't want to cry out. There's a resistance to crying out. They won't do it. So what does God do? Right, it's difficult. What does God do? He strengthens Pharaoh's heart, and he comes running after them. Yes? And when the people see him coming, then they turn their eyes up to God, and they cry out before him. As it says, Vayisu b'nei Yisrael teinehem, and so on. Vayiru v'yitzaku. To God, the same cry as they had cried in Egypt. That is, suddenly they hit that tone. It's almost like a oddly, suddenly they hit that tone which they had in Egypt, and God recognizes the cry, and he says to them, right? He explains to them. He says, well, if I hadn't done that to you, I would never have heard your voice. About that crisis, about this moment, the writer of Shir Hashirim says, my dove in the crevice of the rock, hashmi'ini et kolech. Let me hear your voice. Not the end, not a voice, but your voice, Midrash says. That voice that I know already from the past and that I regard as your true voice. That there's something true that emerges. Now, here's one of the difficulties of this Midrash, with which I'm struggling, and I imagine. And that is that the true voice, it seems, has to do with that cry to God when one is in trouble. Now, I'm not going to spell out all the problems with this. I'm not going to make more trouble for myself. I assume those of you who feel it, feel it. There is something here, particularly as fathers and daughters are concerned, that is very difficult. Manipulations. I said I wasn't going to do it, but here I'm doing it. Yes. There is something here that it leads to endless thought. Choshvim machshavot. I've had a lot of thinking as I've been dealing with this. It says something about the theology of prayer. It says something about what the true voice is. And somewhere that's where I feel I have to look for my thread. What are Chazal doing in presenting us? And they know they're presenting a difficult complex of things here. I think the clue, the thread, has to do with the true voice. How do you know that someone is crying out in truth? That is not in some way just doing what other people do, or, there are all kinds of voices we have, all kinds of social voices, civilized voices, the false self, which for Donald Winnicott, the great British psychoanalyst, the false self is a very large part of ourselves. It's the social self, it's the self that, puts on appearances of all kinds. What is the one moment of real truth, in a way? It's what happens when we are in trouble, what the dove does when she doesn't know which way to go, and she turns towards the dove owner, the dovecote owner. Or we're talking here about crying to God. All right, so if you believe in God, then you understand what that means. And if you don't, I think there are equivalent ways of translating that. It means somehow discovering the deepest truth in one's being, turning towards some kind of source of imaginable salvation. That is, something that allows one to cry. That cry is a true cry. And so it's worthwhile even manipulating things. If nothing else will do, if she's not going to let you hear her true voice, right? We have a lot of resistance to finding that voice. That voice is the last voice in the world, actually, that we choose to express, except in certain very particular circumstances. Aside from moments of crisis, moments where one doesn't know where to turn, the other way in which one uses the scream, and I'm saying something really rather strange, maybe, the other way in which the scream gets modulated, but it still remains there, is in singing. Singing. Wagner actually thought that the origin of singing was in the scream. And if you listen to his operas, you can sometimes hear it. The sopranos really get there. That is, there is something in the nature of singing, of operatic singing particularly, and I want to talk about operatic singing. When we think about Shirat Hayam is a kind of evolution of the scream. And the scream can mean many different things in its rawness, but there is something true about it, and that God wants. Even if it's sarcasm, even if it's an attack on God, it's anger, there is something genuine about it. When one is in that mode, call it hysteria, call it something in which all the guards are let down. You're no longer being civilized. And that movement of the voice is what God desires to hear. It's a strange desire. Not all of us want to hear that voice from our nearest and dearest. Right? It's something that can actually be very repulsive. It's not what one wants to hear. But God wants to hear it. That's the idea here, that he appreciates something about this. And that is Shirah. The Midrash itself says it. The Shirah started with Tza'akah. Tza'akah was the beginning of a Shirah. Chavuyin b'sitro shel yam. Where does that cry or the song come from? It comes from a place of being hidden, repressed inside the sea. Right? Something that you being overwhelmed, engulfed in some way. Something has been well kept down. And then suddenly it bursts forth from its hidden place. And God wants to hear that. Right? It's hidden from the singer herself. The shock when someone suddenly raises their voice and starts singing, someone who really sings. I remember someone who was a student of mine, she told me a lot about her life as a singer, but I never actually heard her sing. And then one day, this rather shy girl sitting near me on the sofa, I said, well, would you sing for me a little? And she said, sure. And this, powerful voice, woman's voice, suddenly sang, and the walls shook. There's a feeling of the power that you don't suspect when you are, in the social presence of someone else. What do we have then? When did Shirah happen? It happened in all sorts of situations, says the Midrash. There was another moment at Har Sinai, where the people suddenly burst into song, as it were, when we were chavuyin b'sitro shel ahar. They were also repressed by the mountain. They were made, the mountain was looming over them like a bucket, according to the Midrash. They're terrified. And suddenly out of there comes a voice. It's a voice that says, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will hear. And that is a kind of scream. Have a look at the passage from the Yalkut in number 5. I think this makes a point. It was a very unexpected find, this one. Vaya'anu kol ha'am. The whole people responded to God's invitation at the Mount Sinai. They all responded yachdav, together, in unison. And they said, Na'aseh v'nishma. And the Midrash comments, Lo anu b'chanufa. They didn't respond in flattery. What an unexpected word. They didn't say appeasingly to God or obsequiously to God, overwhelmed by his power. Yes, we'll do it. Because they all responded together. That means they were not listening to one another. They weren't listening to what each one was saying and saying, oh, I'll do the same thing. This is not crowd dynamics. This is not the usual, this is not kind of false religiosity, where you pick up the mood of how other people are and you decide to go along. You know, I'm also going to say the obedient thing. This was a fully spontaneous moment in which they all in unison, right, without listening to one another. What I appreciate about this is this idea of Chanukah. That is, there are almost every other form of expression, other than the scream, is suspect of Chanukah. Is it really your voice that's speaking? Is that really you, or is it you modulated to the needs of others, the expectations of others, and so on? The one true expression is the scream, what I'll call the tza'akah. And even Har Sinai, somewhere there is something of that. And many other places, according to the Midrash, certain other places, where something repressed suddenly appears. So what do we have then here? That there is not a sense of consensus here. It's a question of each individual spontaneously finding the place where the scream comes from. And then God says to them, through Moshe, Atem tacharishon. In other words, don't worry. Don't worry, I will come now and I'm going to look after you. And Moshe says to the people, Atem tacharishon. You be quiet. You be silent. Unexpected. As if he's telling them, right, I've heard the scream, and now that's enough of that. Be quiet, be silent. The word for lachrish has in it the idea of ploughing deep. Machroshet, lachrosh, is to plough into the depths. Plough deep. Bet Yaakov suggests this. In other words, now internalize your scream. Take that scream inwards. You don't have to actually do it anymore. Right, we've heard. Now take it in deep. Be in that place. And the next thing we hear is Az Yashir Moshe. From that, if we're listening to the sea, not looking at it, but listening. Then we hear a silence, and then they're in the sea, and then Az Yashir Moshe, Uvnei Yisrael. So the song seems to emerge as the next thing after the scream, after the silence, after the scream. And here, I'd like to make one quick digression, and to say this, that what the people have deep inside them, repressed inside them, is a deep storehouse of love and hate, of desire for freedom and desire for slavery, of opposites. I'll focus on the idea of hate, because it's so extreme. What and how do the people hate? What is the rootstock out of which hatred can develop? A people who've been traumatized for hundreds of years. There's a lot of hatred stored up there. A lot of anger, a lot of hatred. How do we know that hatred is active in the people? We don't know till the end of the 40 years. The end of the 40 years, Moshe addresses the people and he reminds them of the story of the spies, what happened 39 years before. And he says to them something that we've never heard before. He says, I know what you were actually saying in your tents that night, the night of weeping, right? The night when you raised your voices. Right? Vatiragnu be'alechem, you grumbled in your tents, you rumbled away you seethed in your tents, and you said, you have to fasten your seatbelts, you said, B'sinat Hashem otanu hotzianu mi'eretz Mitzrayim. Because God hated us, he took us out of the land of Egypt. And Rashi makes that just a little clearer, just focuses it, so we shouldn't miss a grain of it, and says, Hayitzia hotza'ato hayita b'sin'ah, something like that. That the Exodus was a story of hatred. It was God's hatred for the people that made him take the whole, it's a story of hatred to bring them out into the desert, and then they will die ignobly, terribly in the desert. So that's the story they tell themselves. All right, there are objective facts that really they are very afraid of the desert, all kinds of reasons for being afraid. No food, no drink, etc., etc. But the hatred is primary. The hatred is not a sort of accident that depends on objective criteria. The hatred is primary. And Rashi makes things even harder. He doesn't whitewash this at all. But he makes things even harder by saying that the hatred that they imagine God had for them is really a projection. That they hated him. You can see it in Rashi in number 6 on your page. No, number 7. And then he describes the process of projection. It's like when someone has in their heart something against someone else, and he says the other person has that in his heart. So clearly he understood, it was long understood, this dynamic. So the people are struggling with an unconscious hatred. It's unconscious till it becomes conscious. Right? There's something in them is not recognized, which has to do with anger and hatred and frustration and sarcasm. And we're going to hear the tone over and over again as the people complain. We're not going to get as far as calling it hatred, because that's a bit much. That's quite a stark view of things. It's only at the end of the 40 years, when the people have become a little more familiar with themselves. Right? They've had 40 years to get to know themselves and the ways they talk, and perhaps to begin to hear themselves. And hear how often, for instance, they talk about hating God. Ma'astem et Hashem asher b'kir b'chem. You have been repelled. Ma'astem is a very strong word for repulsion and hatred against God, against the land. Right? All these, not pretty things. It takes a long time till that becomes conscious. So Winnicott again will say, love and hate. Both are there in every human being who ever was a baby and who was struggling with primal emotions of love and hate in the most primitive sense, of wanting to eat up the mother and wanting to spit her out if she frustrates him. That's Freud, of course. All right. The sense of these very primal, if I get what I want, then that's good. If I don't get what I want. And that is there in every human being. The worst thing would be if you don't ever get to recognize your own hatred. In other words, you live your life in a kind of illusion that you are really all sweetness and light. Because then, when either, the classic diagnosis is that leads to depression or to projection. You project a lot of hatred on other people, or you take it all in yourself, but aren't willing really to acknowledge it, and that somehow leads to anger and depression seem to be connected. Well, never mind the theory. What do we have in fact? We have here a modulation into song. And with this, I want to move into the area of the song. The tza'akah becomes a song. So God does hear the voice of the people, and he hears it in this modulated form. Where does it all start? It's clear who starts the song. It starts as Yashir Moshe. Then Moshe has the idea that he will sing a song. That's how Rashi explains the future tense. As Yashir. As can mean then. It can mean in the past or in the future. Then in the past, Moses sang. Or then in the future, Moses will sing. Now, since it clearly means historically, he sang, although we're not going to close the other option, it obviously means he sang, so why the future tense? As Yashir. So Rashi says very simply and very powerfully, as Allah b'libo sheyashir shira. Then it arose in his mind that he would sing a song. B'libo, his heart mind. His heart mind suddenly came up with a strange idea that a song is the thing at this moment. What is the moment? And here I want to take a rather minority view of the timing of the song. When did they sing the song? We usually think, and there's evidence in the text for it, that they sing the song after they've emerged from the sea, and they see the Egyptians dead on the seashore, and they know that the story is really over. So they sing a song of triumph. Right? That'd be quite conventional. That's a very conventional thing to do. Nothing surprising about it at all. But there is another view, and for many, many years, that has seemed to me to be the richer view. And that is that they sing b'toch hayam b'yabasha. They sing while they're still in the middle of the sea on the dry land, in that precarious, paradoxical position of being on dry land, but in the middle of the sea. Yes. All with 2 walls of water stacked on either side of them, apparently very solid, but they know very well that they're in the midst of the sea because the sea has crashed down behind them on many, many other human beings. And they can hear them crying their death cries behind them. And what is their experience at that moment but one of terror? It's not one of jubilation and joy and confidence. It's one of terror because they know that Sha'afheim hayunatunim badin ba'ota sha'a. This is the midrashic comment on this moment in their experience, that they know they are also being weighed up in the scales of strict justice, the stark vision of themselves, and how are they going to escape whipping? That who knows, that these walls of water are very precarious. They're not as solid as they look. Even if they're festooned with wonderful fruits and jewels, and the Midrash really has wonderful fantasy material about how beautiful and exciting and ecstatic the experience was, there was also a serious edge of terror associated with it because they're still in the midst of the sea. That idea of the timing you can find in Sforno and Ramban, which is pretty good paternity for this view. And there's more to say about it, but I don't want to take time on that now. So that the tone of the song is going to be affected. Never mind the words. I'm thinking about the melody. I'm not even going to look at the words of the song at all. I'm thinking about how they sing. What do their voices sound like? Everything the text doesn't tell you. When Rashi says, then Moshe decided that he would sing a song, with that sense of the future, that he's going to take a leap towards the future. He's going to do something unobvious. What do you do when you're walking through these precarious corridors with mortality breathing down your neck? What do you do? Oh, sing a song. So suddenly there is this, that's what song is for, which means a kind of, it's a turn of breath. Suddenly you realize there's another tone. And so he does something that's counterintuitive here. Alabalibo, this is the thing to do. And so, as though possessed in some way, the people begin to sing all simultaneously, unless perhaps it's in response. Moshe leads and the people respond. But how is it that everyone knows, exactly the tune and exactly the words? So one of the Hasidic writers, the Shem Shmuel, says, quotes Midrash, even babies in their mother's wombs sang there. Babies at the breast. Babies at the breast and babies in their mother's wombs. So the Shem Yishmuel says naively, apparently he says, but they don't have vocal cords. Babies at the breast don't have vocal cords. How can they sing? It's a serious problem. And he responds something like this. He says, in this case, they were just like everyone else because no one had vocal cords. That is, they sang as though possessed. That is, something sang through them. When one is really singing, one is in a way taken over. Yes, it sings. Who sings? Not I as my usual individual self. There's something else sings. And that that personal, impersonal nature of the song is here inspired by a narrow corridor between death and life. And I want to think particularly about the women's song, because it turns out that when it says Moshe and Bnei Israel sang, it doesn't mean the whole people. It means, and the men. Moshe and the men sang. And then we have a separate story afterwards about how Miriam comes out with her women. All the women come out after her with timbrels and circle dancing. Oh, it's very specifically ring dances. And they sing a separate song with a slight but significant change in words. It's a different genre of scream singing. What is a woman's song? I think a woman's song is a kind of acute version of song in general. Why, asks Stanley Cavell in a book called A Pitch of Philosophy. He's a philosopher, and he writes a lot about music. Even the title of his book, A Pitch of Philosophy, has that pun, pitch, like a pitch of music. And what he discusses opera. And he says he remembers asking his mother as a child, he remembers twice asking her, why are operas so sad? And she didn't have an answer for him, but he remembers lovingly that she was the right person to ask the question, that she understood the question, understood what was behind the question. And then he found an answer, and he finds this in another book, in a book by a French feminist writer, Catherine Clément. I think I referred to her last week. A different book called Opera or the Undoing of Women. Opera or the Undoing of Women. And she says, she changes the question. And she says, well, you've noticed that women generally die at the end of the opera. There seems to be a high mortality rate of operatic heroines. I mean, the heroes also don't do so well. But the women really, why? And comes up with this Zen answer and says, she who sings must die. A woman who dares sing, a woman who lifts up her voice, Vatisait kola, a woman who has the courage to lift up her voice, is speaking for something, for a whole world, for a way of thinking. Right? In her singing, she is thinking out loud. What is her thought about? Her thoughts are the thoughts of desire, about the desire for the man she loves, the desire for a kind of ideal life, an ideal world that's different from the world that she lives in. And I'll quote from Cavell because he puts it so beautifully that it's best to do that. He says, opera is naturally pitched at this brink, this edge between worlds, in which the heroine is attracted to transform a given world. The heroine has an encompassing sense of another realm flush with this one, right next to this one. There is an olam haba, as it were. There is another realm right beside this one, into which there is no reason one shouldn't step. Why shouldn't I make that short little step into that other world? And in that other world, everything is quite different, right? The laws of desire are very different from the laws of this world. Music reveals this transcendent or transfiguring realm, as if, after all, tigers can understand and birds can talk and statues come to dinner. Yeah, Don Giovanni, yes. And as if minds can read one another. I like that one particularly. Isn't that a world as the world should be, in which minds can read one another, in which we don't misunderstand each other, and so on and so on. And of course in opera it's very simple. She just sings her words. She sings her mind. And he sings his mind, so their minds are completely in communion. But there is great abandonment and great grief in the song of the women who move into that other world. That is also a world of abandonment and desertion. It's a world in which the scream is very, very near to the surface. It's not an idyllic world. It's a sense then, Cavell says, of being pressed or stretched between worlds. This world in which one is seen, one normal way, and another world in which one is heard, in which one is to be heard, one's voice is heard, and into which one releases or abandons one's spirit, and which recedes when the breath of the song ends. One can hold that world as long as one is singing. And then when one stops singing, there is the crash back into reality, and the heroine dies of it. She can't survive. But there's a difficult passage between the worlds, and she can't quite make it back. She can't. There is a wonderful film by Kieślowski, the Polish director, called Veronique, The Double Life of Veronique, talking about two worlds. Veronique is a young woman who has a beautiful voice, who is very spiritual, and who also, we are told, has a weak heart. That's a fatal combination. Don't be very spiritual and have a weak heart and sing. She lifts up her voice in song, and her voice rises higher and higher and higher, and then she crashes, and there is a kind of general crash as the instruments stop, and everything stops. There is a tragic implication somewhere in this move into that world of woman's song. Take that as you will. A sense of singing out of a world in which another world is intervening. Right? As I move in this world, there is this other ecstatic world, of very different kind, into which, I can just step and sing. But can I find a way back? There. The voice is always before and beyond itself. Our beyond is not eventual, but always. I love that sentence in Kaval. Our beyond, Olam Haba, is not eventual Olam Haba. It's one way of thinking about it, At the end of things, one comes to Olam Haba. But Olam Haba can be at every moment the world that is just always. It's always there, just to one side. Does one want to turn towards it, or does one not? Is it a risk? For Cavell, that's what opera says, it's a fatal risk, particularly for women, because they really enter that world. And I want to come back now to our story and to say that it seems that the women sing but do not die. Right? They are singing as one sings, as operatic heroines sing, I want to suggest. But they don't die of it. What can we say about these women? What keeps them somewhere able to engage that passage between one world and another? First of all, what did they come out of Egypt with? Betupim uv'mecholot. Everyone else doesn't manage to stay to have the bread rise, right? They're in such a rush to get out that they have to come out with flat bread. Number 9, but they come out with tupim uv'mecholot. They had time to pack timbrels. Just a moment, I've got to pack my timbrels. Muftachot hayu tzidkaniyot shabador. The righteous women of that generation, which means all the women. Righteous women is just a way of saying all the women. All the women of that generation were assured that God does miracles for them. Not that he will do, but that they know God very intimately as the one who keeps them alive in the passage, them and their babies, alive in the passage between life and death. If you want to read up about this, you can see the passage in the Gemara in Sotah in number 8, which describes the extreme danger in which the women gave birth in the fields of Egypt, and how God came either himself or by sending an angelic midwife, or bichvodo uvatzmo, and acted midwife to these women as they lay in double danger, giving birth, and prepared the child for the world. And then horrendous description of the skin of your teeth terror of Egypt that followed, the women and the babies. They are saved in the most, read it yourselves. And so that in the end of the story, when they come to the sea, Heim hekiruhu tchila. They recognized God first. In other words, they knew him. And when they see God, as it were, by the sea, they say, oh, Zakeli. No, there's my God. They point their finger at him and they say, oh, I know, because I'm very intimate. I know what God has to do with the space between life and death. That somewhere, that's where he's been for me. So in that sense, the song that they move into now, right, they're prepared for it in some way. That they come with the timbrels already because they know that miracles are in a way part of the day's work. Olam Haba is right there. There's always that possible dimension if one turns towards it. Have a look now at number 11. And now I'm really going to be rushing you. Number 11, apparently no connection with this. First of all, Miriam. Miriam, where did she get her name? Midrash suggests, right, the most counterintuitive thing, that she is named for bitterness. Mar. Vayimararu et chayehem. At the moment in the persecution story, in the moment of the Holocaust, where it says they embittered their lives. That's when she was born. So now you know the date of her birth. You know the climate into which she was born, and that bitterness seeped into her and came out as music. Came out as a scream and as music. And if you find that hard to hold together, I don't know what else I can say to convince you. I was born at a similar time, and I feel as if it's it's absolutely clear to me, the connections between the bitterness and the music. What is music born out of, if not out of melancholy and loss and grief? And that is that sense, in some sense, of abandonment and of passion and of hope. That mixture is very volatile. It can take many forms, and one form is the form of song, ecstatic song. So that's as far as Miriam is concerned. What about, let's have a look at this midrash. What will the end of the world look? What will Olam Haba look like? L'atid lavo. God will be surrounded by a dancing circle of the righteous. Now you know. There will be a divine, transcendent choreography at the end of days of the righteous dancing around God in a circle, machol, the tzadikim, machol. Remember Miriam's machol? She danced in a ring dance. And they'll all be pointing their fingers to the center of the circle and singing, Ze Elokim Elokeinu, Ki Ze Elokim Elokeinu Olam Va'ed. This is God, our God, forever and ever. Hu Yinahagenu Almut. He will lead us Almut. What does Almut mean? 3 levels of meaning. Almut, beyond death. That is, he has brought us through. Through death to now, right? That other now. That's only the first suggestion. The second one is really amazing. The second one is alamot, like young girls. The righteous are all feeling young girlish. They are all feeling somehow skittish. What's an alma? Someone who is, elem is a stripling. It's someone who barely doesn't have any flesh on his bones yet. He doesn't ever actually put his feet on the ground. She doesn't put her feet on the ground. She's always, she's always on tiptoe. She's always running around everywhere. She's barely embodied in some sense. And that kind of freedom and vigor and so forth, if the tzaddikim want to imagine an ideal state of being, then they say they're going to dance like young girls. Miriam is called ha'alma. It's a very unusual word to use for a young girl. It's only used here when she goes off to find a wet nurse for the princess. She's called ha'alma. And Rashi comments it's a function of her zrizut, of her light-footedness. So Miriam is a reference here. The machol is a reference also to the ring dance of Miriam. This kind of code here. What does this end of the world scene have to do with our scene by the sea? And this is now filled out in a very intriguing and rich commentary by the Ma'or Shemesh, Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Epstein, 19th century commentary on the Torah, number 12. And I'll summarize it very quickly because we're almost out of time. And he says this. He says, what you had there by the sea is in a way an enactment of what there will be at the end of days. There is something olam haba about what happens there in the sea, in the sense that you have a ring dance led by young girls, right, by Miriam and her sprightly maidens. She might not have been a maiden in age, but her nature was one in which past, present, and future, somewhere she can dance between them. She can contain the past. She can somewhere invoke the future in her dance. And what she's doing here is enacting through a circle a peculiarly feminine mode. Right? The circle is a feminine motif, as opposed to the straight line, which is a masculine motif. And what is happening here is the image of the end of days, the image of the future, is one in which all the this worldly structures will no longer be valid, in which all the hierarchies of this world, of men and women, he makes a big point of that. What we have in this world is men and women. We have teachers and students. We have those who are above and those who are beneath. It's a question always of gradually perhaps learning. The teachers teach the students, and perhaps one day they will grow to be as big as the teachers. That is, distinctions between different groups of people, social distinctions of all kinds, distinctions in every level of life. in the world to come, there will be one big circle of equidistant beings, equidistant from God and pointing directly towards God, as if connected from inside out. And that idyllic sense of things is in itself a feminine mode. Right? That this is the way women think in some way, this circle way of thinking. But he insists paradoxically on saying that what you'll have then will not be a feminine thing. It will be actually beyond male-female altogether. Right? The structure will be of a circle, but the circle will be one in that men are dancing. Everyone will be dancing indiscriminately. There will be no difference in that sense between those who are higher or lower. That sense, that ecstatic sense of the ultimate, we have actually beside us. Right? It's not eventual, but always. When do we have it? Well, at least twice a year, he points out, when we dance Hakafot. When we dance Hakafot on Hoshana Rabbah and Simchat Torah, what we're doing in a way is bringing down limshoch, something ultimate, a kind of ecstatic state, in which all the distinctions vanish, and suddenly there is a sense in this wheeling circle, there is a sense of a different kind of grasp of past, present, and future, of the various things that normally are so clearly separated from us, men and women, for instance. In that sense, he quotes from Yirmiyahu, that then at the end of time, there will be a time when no one will teach anyone else to know God. Right? There won't be this condescension, this movement of difference. At that time, then everyone will, unekeva tisovev gever, and the female will move around the male. Like at the chuppah, where the woman, the kala, walks around. What does that suggest? One of the things it suggests, I think, is tisovev means to court. In other words, she will be the one who takes the initiative. She will have what normally was considered to be the male role before. And that won't be by way of saying that women are triumphant. It'll be by way of saying, on the contrary, that now male-female doesn't have any meaning at all. Now it's just a matter of this structure of oceanic unity of some kind. Now, in that sense, what is Miriam doing? Miriam now is bringing that ultimate reality down into this world when she leads her women out in their circle dance with her tupim. They are prepared for transcendence in some way because it's not eventual, it's always. And as they dance in this way, she sings Shiru Lashem. Moses sings, Moshe sings Ashira Lashem. And as he points out, the Morav Shemesh points out, that is very different. Moshe belongs in this world, strangely, even though he's the one who will go to the top of the mountain and he will be with God, but that's in the future. We don't know about that yet. Up to this point, he still wants to maintain the distinctions and the distances of this world. Not yet. In other words, that ecstasy, that's for some other world. In this world, Ashira Lashem, I will one day sing to God. I will one day achieve that kind of total ecstasy. That's for the future, not for the present. Whereas Miriam is empowered in some strange way to say Shiru Lashem, that she has this conviction that she can moshech, the word that keep Hasidic commonplace. And imshoch is to take something that seems out of reach and draw it towards you, extend it towards you, take it along with you. In other words, what you are doing is actually making it move from the future into the present. And you're saying, actually, there is a connection. If I want to see it, I can actually see in the present moment something of that ultimate future. And the irony, of course, is that all this arises out of a tzaka. That the original movement was a scream. That was where some kind of truth was first heard. And it's under the passion of that truth that there is this desire, the women's desire, to make it happen now. Right? The more bitterness, the more desire. Right? The more sadness, the more desire. And no one dies of it. Miriam doesn't die of it, but her bitterness, after the song has ended, what happens to her bitterness? Very briefly. I know you're ready to go. Immediately, the people don't find water, right? Immediately afterwards, they don't find water. 3 days without water. They find bitter waters. And the word bitter is used 4 times in different forms in one verse. As if to remind us, of what we have just gone through, and that what is left now is a kind of fallback. It's a fallback position in which what has been so amazingly, miraculously integrated for a moment, for the time of the song, now separates out again into its elements, and now you have the bitterness, the bitter voice of complaint and so forth, of need and complaint by itself, and Miriam's song is silenced for the time being. And the people come around in the end, right at the end of the Parsha, to asking this very deep question about themselves, as if this is really what it's all been about. They say, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin. Is God in our midst or not? B'kirbeinu, to say in our midst, then we think somewhere elegantly of, among the people. But as it's often been translated, b'kirbeinu means in the midst of me and my body. That is, like my heart. Is God in my heart? But almost physically thinking of one's body, and is God right in there, in the depths of me, or not? Who should know, if not they? In other words, who are they asking? Who are they asking, is God in me or is he not? It's a question only they can answer. And the answer to it, obviously, they don't know. They really don't know if God is in them, just as they don't know that hate is in them. Let's say at the other end of the spectrum. They are at the beginning of a process, of a very difficult process, of trying now to catch up with what they knew intuitively, at least the women knew, in the Yam Suf. And now the question will be for them, who is the God that we can really house within us? Perhaps the only way of approaching that will be, in some sense, through music. That is, if their whole being becomes re-musicked. That's a term that Oliver Sacks uses about one of his victims in his book Awakenings, the victims of encephalitis who have been paralyzed for decades. And he sees one music teacher, and she says, whenever there's music playing, I come alive for the time of the music. And then I go back to the beginning of this kind of re-enlivening. She says, as I have been unmusicked, I must be re-musicked. That's what this woman says in Oliver Sacks. And I take that as a kind of headline for what happens in the development of the people. That somewhere the people have to be re-musicked. They have to begin to discover again how to dance out of the frame, how to somewhere begin to rediscover that freedom. And that will take a lot of work, of very hard work. And very unpleasant, to put it mildly, very unpleasant experiences. But experiences in which perhaps it will become possible for their bodies to house God. The Torah, mityashevet begufan, the Midrash actually says, in case you thought that was my rather daring, that the Torah, they'll receive Torah, that they'll be given Torah. That's only part of the story, that God gives the Torah. The more important part is, how will they allow the Torah to settle in their bodies? How will they allow it to be accepted, to be received, so that it can be a source of music and dancing? Thank you. Who are you?
My name is Hannah Greenberg, and I used to learn with you in my time.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And for a couple of years, for one thing and another, I couldn't make it anymore. But I realize now how much I missed you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Brought your book.
With pleasure. Yes, I don't. Oh, you have a
My
pen.
name is Hannah Greenberg.
Good.
And this is the pen.
Yes.
And
Ah, here it is. Yes.
this, I think,
Hi. How are you? Good to see you. Wow.
C-H-A-N, whatever.
Wow, what memories. That's what we have, memories. Like the Jewish
Thank you
people.
very much.
Ladies.
Like
Thank
the Jewish people. I was so interested in what you said about Hashem playing sort of tricks with the Jewish people to get them aroused, to get them to understand. That's probably what we go through in life as well.
You know a lot about that.
Well, I'm saying it's so true. Maybe he wants each individuals to get to some sort of understanding, and you don't get to such understanding as a child. Maybe as you go through life experiences. I think that was so remarkable.
Thank you.
You're wonderful.
You're a darling.